All right, so in this video, we're going to continue going through chapter 24, and we're going to look at now that the Spanish have finally taken over and colonized the Western Hemisphere. Now let's take a look at the effects of that. So we're going to look at Spanish colonial society. That's what we're going to do for most of this. I think towards the end of the video, we'll shift into a little bit of economics. But for most of what we're going to talk about here, it's social stuff, Spanish society. Now, the people who lived in the Western Hemisphere prior to the Spanish showing up really didn't live in cities. The cities were kind of ceremonial centers where people didn't really live. They kind of visited when there was something to happen, when something was happening, and then they went out to live in rural areas again. So the cities really weren't cities like we might understand them. But the Spanish loved cities. And built several, or not several, they built a lot of cities. So one of the big early social implications of the Spanish showing up was a big urbanization process. People started to move to cities. Now, typically, we think of the Spanish colonial society as a mestizo society. So this society is called a mestizo society. Mestizo is a word that means mixed. So this is a mixed society. It is a multicultural, multi-ethnic society. So there are lots of different cultures and lots of different ethnicities living together, dominated by European or more generally white people. So there's lots of different kinds of people, and there's lots of different kinds of mixed race people living in this society, but the people on top of it are European or white. And so basically the distinction is either born in Europe or born in the colony to two white parents. As long as you're white, you're going to do fine. Okay, so this kind of system was very hierarchical. This was a very hierarchical system. And basically, the whiter you looked, or could prove, the higher you were in the society. So if you were white or you looked white, you would have a better shot in this society than if you had darker skin. So at the very top of this society were the people who were called Peninsulares. Peninsulares are Spanish people from Spain. So they have come over on a boat. These are people from Spain, and these are the people who rule these colonies. The viceroys, these guys are Peninsulares, Spanish people from Spain. They are at the top. Beneath these guys are going to be the Creoles. Creoles are people born in the colony with two white parents. The Creoles are just as white or just as European as the Peninsulares. The only difference, the Creoles were born in the colonies. The Peninsulares were born in Spain. Beneath the Creoles, we're going to start to find a lot of mixed race people. There are a lot of mixed race people in the colonies. And the reason for that is that 85% of the colonists were men. So if you were coming over to the colonies to look for work, 85% of them were men. So a lot of them took native women as wives. A lot of them got married to native women. There was also a lot of they would take native women as wives, or we'll say girlfriends. And unfortunately, there was also quite a bit of rape and sexual assault. So what you end up with are a lot of people of mixed race. Now, the rape and sexual assault was usually towards African slaves, but there are a number of cases of this towards Native American women. So it's a very unfortunate effect of this. Most of them being men, and the European view was that these people were not, they were inferior to the Europeans, and that the Europeans were superior. So it's just an uncomfortable truth, unfortunately. So you get a lot of mixed race people. Now, here's where things start to get even more kind of uncomfortable and kind of weird. We get a very complicated system of racism to determine social rank. Now, from what I can tell, there are about 128 different categories of race based on your genealogy, so your family tree. So the important thing to note about this is that when we think about the mixed race people, the whiter you were, meaning European, the more European you were, the higher you were in this system. So if you could prove you had a European grandparent, you would be higher than somebody who had a European great-grandparent. So just to give you a couple of ideas of how complicated this was, if you were the child of a European and a Native American, you were considered a mestizo. Now, these guys are below the Creoles, but because they have a European parent, whether they're a Creole or a Peninsulare, that meant that they were better off than someone who had less European blood in them. If your parents were European and African, then you were considered to be a mulatto. And if you were the product of a Native American and African parents, you were considered to be a Zombo. Now, there are dozens of combinations, because if a Mestizo and a Zombo had a child, that child would be categorized as something else. The point is that this was very hierarchical. It was very racist, but it was also really easy to trick or fool or pass off as something else. So we're not going to get into like every single category because it's not important. A couple of other points about this hierarchical system. Slaves were, of course, at the very bottom. And the Spanish liked full-blooded people, except the slaves, better than mixed race people, generally. So if you were a full-blooded Native American, you might be considered to be a higher class than maybe a mestizo. Maybe. Now, the other thing to note about mestizo society is that it was super patriarchal, which should not be a surprise because just about every society we've looked at is super patriarchal. But here's the thing that makes it slightly different. The patriarchy applies differently to different races. So European women were oppressed just like they would have been in Europe. They had some informal influence within their family. But generally speaking, European women didn't really have any rights. Now, Native women, Native American women, had quite a bit more freedom. And could have jobs and their own stuff. But of course, they were below European women. And then finally, African women were equal to African men in that they are both slaves. So depending on how you look at it, society is patriarchal in different ways depending on what kind of woman you are. Now, this is all very uncomfortable to talk about, but remember, it's just the facts of the time. Now, I want to shift gears here for just a little bit and talk about the Spanish colonial economy. Now, the Spanish colonial economy was heavily based on silver mining. So they found these giant mountains of silver, and so the Spanish colonial economy was heavily based on extracting that silver. And to extract the silver, they use this thing called the Mestizo system. So the Mestizo system was something that the Inca used. It was basically a tax in the form of forced labor. It was a tax in the form of forced labor. The Spanish use it because the people are familiar with it. The other reason the Spanish had to use this is because the mines are up in the mountains, and it requires training to mine. The altitude and the training the Native Americans already had. So they were used to the altitude, and they were used to doing the work. So the Native Americans had to do it. African slaves just couldn't do this job. African slaves just couldn't do this job. Now, this was a very dangerous job. It was very dangerous to do this. Not only is it dangerous to be a miner, mining is dangerous in general. And to extract the silver you have to use mercury. So mercury, as you might be aware, is very toxic. So not only is getting the silver out of the mountain dangerous, but to get the silver out of the rocks themselves, you have to use mercury, and mercury is very toxic. So, unfortunately, some mothers would purposefully maim their children to get them out of the Mestizo system. Better that you have a permanent limp than be killed doing this mining work. Another way that the Spanish used the colonies was through this thing called the Hacienda System. The Hacienda System was similar to encomienda. It was similar to encomienda. So here's how it worked. The Spanish sold the Native Americans farming supplies and to pay back the Spanish, because they didn't have any money, the Native Americans worked off their debt. But here's the thing. The interest was so high, they never could get out from under the debt. So, you essentially create a new system of slavery. And this was called debt peonage. When we think about present day human trafficking, this is one way that human traffickers can trick people into doing work they may not want to do. Like, we'll get you out of the country you're in, and in return, you've got to do some work for us, and you'll pay us back through your labor, but you never can. And so you're stuck doing that work, essentially, as a slave. Now, I want to say one more thing about the silver mining. And we're going to come back to this throughout time period 4, because the silver mining is going to have wide-reaching global implications. Now, you might think that the silver mining made the Spanish wealthy forever. And initially, they were. They were super crazy wealthy for a little while. But flooding the market with all that silver made silver less valuable. Silver was valuable because there was not a lot of it. But if all of a sudden you start putting silver into the system over and over and over again, it becomes less valuable. And so at the end of all of this, the Spanish economy collapses. And it wasn't just Spain's economy that collapses. And we'll talk a lot more about this when we get there. But the Chinese economy starts to collapse. Because the Chinese only accept silver as taxes. You can't pay your taxes any other way than with silver. And as the Spanish economy collapses because of all of the silver, so does the Chinese economy. So there are global implications of what the Spanish are doing here, extracting all of the silver and flooding the market with it. So you might not expect it, but as far away as China, they're going to have economic ripples because of what the Spanish are doing in South America. So this is kind of the start of a global economy. So we're going to stop there. In our last video on chapter 24, we're going to look at what the other Europeans are doing now that the Spanish have figured out that there are 2 whole new continents to go explore. The other Europeans are going to get involved too, and in our next video, we'll see what they get themselves into. So until then, this is Mr. Nissen signing off.